Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Here's Johnny. Johnny, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. We're about to talk about my favorite subject, and I'm pretty sure by this time all my listeners are tired of hearing me talk about it, but I'm going to keep shouting it from the rooftops. Johnny, please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, my name's Johnny Cairns. I've been studying the assassination of President Kennedy for a number of years now. I've co-authored a book with Dave O'Brien. He's a Canadian researcher called Case Not Closed. And I've talked at various conferences, Lancer conferences, which are held in Dallas each year. And I have also written 3 articles on the subject called A Presumption of Innocence, Lee Harvey Oswald, which is in 3 parts, which you can find on Jim D. Genial's website, Kennedy's and King.
When it comes to case not closed, people would say case is closed because Oswald's dead, but the case actually has never officially closed. It's still an open thing to this day because there wasn't enough evidence to say that Oswald was guilty. They couldn't even pin him on the murder of President Kennedy. I'm pretty sure they were trying to pin him on the murder of Officer Tippit.
Yeah, that's right. He was originally charged with Tippett's murder. And then apparently charged with Kennedy's murder later on. But according to Sylvia Mager, he wasn't actually charged with the president's murder. But yeah, I mean, people seem to think that the Tippett case and the Kennedy case, for example, go hand in hand, when in reality they're 2 separate murder cases and they should always be treated as such. So the evidence in the Tippett case speaks for itself and the evidence in the Kennedy case speaks for itself. And in my opinion, the evidence in either case isn't sufficient enough to get a conviction of Oswald.
Well, do you think it's important to draw the distinction between the two? Because I know people can, like, for my initial, I guess, research or look into in the investigation of the assassination of JFK, Oswald is obviously mentioned all over the place. Whether you believe that he was a lone man that killed the president or whether you believe the other. I think that it's good to just separate the two. I try my best when I'm looking at the assassination or just the JFK case in general as multiple different incidences that you have to handle separately, mostly because there's so much evidence your head's going to explode on just everything you can get distracted with. When Jim was on here, I was just so obsessed with the medical evidence. I mean, you find out all this stuff about skull fragments and all this. You're like, oh my God. But then you get into Oswald and it's kind of a different pace, a different speed. I'm curious to what was your initial thing that got you attracted to at least Oswald's, his alleged guiltiness?
So basically, my dad, he used to read a lot, various different subjects from like religion to politics to just whatever. And one of the areas he was interested in was John F. Kennedy and his murder in Dallas. And I used to just like sit and ask him questions about it. And he kind of was telling me about like the facts behind it and watch some documentaries, like stuff, and documentaries on both sides, whether people believe in the Warren Commission or not, which I think is very important. I think you've got to equate yourself with the 2 sides of the argument. And I just got hooked on that. You know, I really fascinated me. And once I kind of weighed up the evidence, at a later date, I kind of thought to myself, this doesn't make sense. I mean, the whole scenario, the official shooting scenario just doesn't make sense. And then when you really get into the evidence, you find out that really the case against Oswald is non-existent. But yeah, it was through him. He used to just talk to me about different things, and from John Kennedy to Bobby Kennedy and his assassination as well. And just about world history, history's always fascinated me. I am a student of history. And I've just been interested in it ever since. And I think it helps as well that John and Robert Kennedy are political heroes of mine as well. I really admire them for what they tried to do. And I always like to say a special thanks to John Kennedy as well, because it wasn't for President Kennedy and his stance during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't be having this conversation, because obviously his advisors were telling him to basically bomb Cuba, nuclear strike Russia, and etc. And he resisted that. So always have a special thanks for John Kennedy.
We might be here today. We just might be more in a Mad Max scenario.
Yeah, yeah, well, it could be.
But when it comes to what,
All
take me through the first piece of evidence that really to you was something that just was like, this is something that you wouldn't really have in court. I know people bring up the chain of custody on the bullet, and I know there's discrepancies on times. I know there's discrepancies on initials that are signed on it. Um, when it came to even, was it the bullet that got you, or was it something else?
to be honest, I think the whole um, the whole story about the rifle. I think like mail ordering the rifle, that just never ever made sense to me. Why would a guy mail order a weapon to himself that could be traced under an alias to his own personal PO box? That never made sense to me, really, because no matter what, it's going to be traced back to you anyway, regardless if it's under an alias or not. So that was always very weird. Yeah, C399. I mean, let's be honest, no prosecution in the land would dare try and admit in the court. And I think, as I say, in case not closed as well, if I was defense attorney for Oswald, and I'm not a lawyer, but if I was defense attorney for Oswald, I would happily allow it in the court, because the chain of custody is so non-existent. It's incredible. And I mean, there's that. There's CE142, which is the paper bag. Ian Griggs, who actually started Daily Plaza UK, which I'm a member of, and so is Bart Camp. He wrote a fantastic article, probably one of the best on CE142, called "The Paper Bag That Never Was," and that just kind of details the kind of journey of this paper sack that allegedly held this Mannlicher Cannell, this broken down rifle. Yeah, stuff like that. The palm print on the rifle, it just all doesn't make sense. But yeah, I would probably say the thing that really got me into it was the Mannlicher itself and its condition as of at the time of the assassination. If you read the testimony in the Warren report in the Warren Commission, you find different people testifying to the condition of this rifle, and it was in a state. I mean, the scope was defective. Misaligned, just all sorts of stuff like that. And they're asking us to believe that this man assassinated the president with this rifle, this defective rifle. And also, as well, if you read the testimony of Simmons, he actually testifies that the U.S. Army, because he was with the U.S. Army, to test fire the weapon, the U.S. Army actually had to modify the weapon itself. They had to put metal shims in the scope. And in doing so, they basically invalidated the weapon as evidence because it's been worked upon. It's not in its original condition as of the assassination. So, yeah, if there was a case today, they couldn't use the rifle as evidence.
Well, to me, my question, even with the rifle, was people say that he fired FMJ bullets, full metal jacket bullets, at President Kennedy. And I go, okay, so if you're saying he fired full metal jacket bullets, which a lot of the lone nutters, that's how they say, fired full metal jacket bullets, but then you're denying that he was Central Intelligence? So where the fuck are they selling full metal jacket bullets to the general public? I thought that's specifically a military grade thing, especially back then. I mean, I don't see that as an ease and access or something you would get online on a magazine. So I start like these are things that are just they're conflicts, you know what I mean? And then another conflict would be the exact thing with the rifle and then the stock. That the little strap that was on it, that the pins were not the exact same in the ones that were pictured. And you start getting into this scenario where it's like, okay, so if they're saying it's his rifle and they have a photo, but the photo doesn't match the actual rifle that's there, that's something that would be a red flag in a court, if I'm not mistaken.
I think a lot of people put a lot of stock into the backyard photographs, and a lot of the debate's always been: are they genuine or are they fake?
They're fake.
In my opinion, even if they were genuine, okay, doesn't prove that he killed the president. I mean, you can't prove that that weapon that the figure is holding is the murder weapon. You just can't prove it. I mean, there's no way to prove it. So to me, I've never put a lot of stock into it. I mean, they were taken what in March 1963, end of March apparently, according to Marina Oswald. So I don't put a lot of stock into the backyard photographs at all. To me, it doesn't prove that Oswald killed President Kennedy. It doesn't prove that he did kill President Kennedy. I think if you really want to kind of find out if Oswald did kill President Kennedy, then you've got to study the commission's own evidence. You've got to study the origin of that evidence. You've got to study the chain of custody for that evidence. And once you start really getting to grips with the evidence, you really start to think, wow, this case is a shambles. And it wouldn't have gone, in my opinion, I don't think it would have even got to court. I mean, it was that bad. I mean, there's just different aspects that I will obviously speak about here. And then when you really kind of figure it out, you're like, wow, this is really a hatchet job. And I mean, the story's simple, right? The official story. He takes his rifle that he owns up to the 6th floor. He assembles the rifle. He leaves behind these cartridges. He leaves behind the gun. So to a layman, it's like, oh, it definitely is him. But when you start to really uncover, like the bag, for example, C142, there is no pictures of C142 on the 6th floor, you know. And then I think one of the FBI experts, when during his commission testimony, was asked about was there any oil found on the bag? Was there any markings which you could link the bag scientifically to the broken down Manly car? He said no. So how could a broken down, well oiled rifle, okay, and a paper bag leave absolutely no trace of any oil or any creases or anything that could scientifically link the bag to the weapon? I mean, imagine that in a court of law. I mean,
well, I think
how can you
the point that would get brought up in a court of law probably would be an aspect of when the police went to the Payne's house and they went into their garage and that blanket that was folded over and they picked it up and nothing was in it. And then that's when Miss Payne said that, oh my God, it could have been Oswald. I think the fact that there was this rumor that the rifle was hidden in there, I think that, I mean, there's so much about like the whole case that has me back and forth on so many different things. But the main thing I stick to is if we're talking about a guy firing bullets at a motorcade, that's moving in a direction away from normally when you would fire, he would have had a better shot coming down when it was coming at him rather than moving away from him. But then you have where the creation of the magic bullet is. They didn't account for one of those shots being fired off and hitting James Tagg in the face after it bounced off a curb. And then so they make this bullet magically do all this damage and still come out in pristine condition. I mean, for me, I just go, if people are saying they're hearing 4 shots or 5 shots, but you only are accounting for 3, there's an issue. And also the fact is, if you're saying, what about the bullet that's in the top of the little car, the one that managed to hit a dent up there, or the cracked front windshield? That's stuff in court that would get brought up. But then you got to think about what the other side would say to that.
Yeah, I think with relation to the shots themselves, a lot of the testimony that always seems to be discounted from those that believe Oswald was guilty is the testimony of James Connolly and James Connolly, John Connolly, and his wife Nellie, and they both testified that they heard the first shot. I think John said that he heard the first shot. He turned around and he noticed it was a rifle shot, and he said the president was reacting. I think his wife Nellie said the president was reacting to the first shot. John wasn't hit by the first shot, and then there was a second shot, and then that's when he felt the bullet in his back. So John Connolly basically discredits the magic bullet, the magic bullet hypothesis. And I mean, let's be honest as well, half of the Warren Commission didn't even believe it. I mean, you've got Senator Richard Russell who never believed it, and he wanted it on the record of his dissent. And he was duped because they said that, yes, there'll be a stint in one of the meetings that was called the Warren Commission. They said there was going to be a stenographer in the room that was going to record Russell's dissent, and they never done it. I think actually Harold Weisberg was one of the ones that showed them, no, there's no dissent here. And he kind of, then after he found that out, then he came out and publicly said that he kind of didn't believe didn't believe it, and I think John Sherman Cooper as well, he didn't believe it. I think Millard Boggs. So you've got half, or just under half, of the Warren commissioners themselves that didn't believe the single bullet theory. And of course, as we see in Jim's fantastic documentary, now did Lyndon Johnson. So he had doubts about it as well. So again, as I always will say, the magic bullet theory or the single bullet theory, it doesn't prove to kill President Kennedy. People seem to think that if the magic bullet theory is possible, then that's automatically it's Oswald that fired the shot. And I don't agree with that.
Well, it's an interesting point here is that how do you think there's enough evidence that wouldn't last in court if you look at the number of people that were able to create so many magnificent theories when it comes to the magic bullet or when it comes to other aspects? I mean, if it's the government, they half of those people had law degrees. I start feeling like could it be dismissed in court? I mean, as much as we know there's evidence to prove that he's innocent, there's plenty of evidence that could be manipulated or twisted in such a way that necessarily might not come off the way that we think about it.
I've spoke to quite a number of, well, I said quite a number. I've spoke to a few attorneys that have been interested in this case, like Larry Schnapp and Bill Simpich. And I actually watched, they done a mock trial Oswald, Kappa done a mock trial Oswald, maybe 2018, 2017. And I think it was only like a 2-day thing. So I can't even remember what the outcome was. I think it was just like a kind of hung jury or whatever. But they talk about like the evidence, what could be allowed into court or not. The problem that well, not the problem, but all evidence is governed by chain of custody. So you've got, even in the 1960s, you had to prove that object A, which was found in location A, is the same object that is being presented in a court of law. And this is done by like witness markings, photography, and all this kind of stuff. You know, I mean, it has to be like a solid link, has to be like a solid chain of possession from the court, from the crime scene to the courtroom. If any of that chain is broken, then the evidence can be ruled as inadmissible in a court of law. And a lot of, obviously, like lawyers that study the case, like Mark Lane, for example, or Jeremy Gunn, or Jim Garrison. I mean, Garrison was obviously a prosecutor, but they could see the serious holes in the prosecution's case. I always call the commission the prosecution because that's what the report reads like. It reads like a prosecutorial brief. So they are governed by that, and it's up. The burden of proof is on the prosecution in a court of law. So the state, which would have been Henry Wade, would have to have proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald was guilty of killing President Kennedy. We know that you cannot have a lone gunman without Commission Exhibit 399. And if they tried to introduce Commission Exhibit 399 in a court of law, then you would have had people like Tomlinson, like Wright, Johnson, and Rowley. Rowley was chief of the Secret Service. Johnson was a Secret Service agent. Tomlinson was the hospital employee that found the bullet. And Wright, who was a retired Dallas police officer, or ex-Dallas police officer who worked in the hospital, these people would have to have testified. And I don't know if you've ever read 6 Seconds in Dallas, but Josiah Thompson went to Parkland Hospital with photographs of CE-399 and presented it to Wright. And Wright said, that's not the bullet that I had. The bullet that I had a pointed tip. And he went in his drawer and he gave Thompson a bullet that resembled the bullet that was found in Parkland that day. So we have on the record O.P. Wright saying that bullet, CE-399, was not the bullet that was found in the hospital that day. And that's pretty damning. And I mean, Tomlinson as well, he couldn't identify the bullet. Neither could Johnson and neither could Rowley. So that's a major blow to the prosecution's case. But here's the rub: why would the prosecution want these people on the stand testifying to that? They just wouldn't, simply because it would hurt their case too much. So that's just one aspect of the case against Oswald, and it's an important aspect. And I think once, if you had a lawyer, for example, like Mark Lane, who really knew the case, I genuinely think Oswald, if it went to court, then he would have been probably acquitted. Problem being, though, is there was so much fraudulent information coming out against Oswald while he was arrested, that it might have been very difficult to actually find 12 impartial jurors, or an impartial jury, because they were, because like sewn deep into the psyche of the people was, this man's guilty because we're getting told he's guilty, and it was like over and over again, he was guilty, he was guilty. And actually, Mark Lane wrote a brilliant article called "The Lawyer's Brief," and he talks about it. He says that he doesn't. Oswald might not have been able to got a fair trial in the United States, let alone in Dallas, Texas. So, but if you take it on the face value of the evidence and what we know today, then yeah, I don't think he would have been. I don't think he would have been tried at all. I don't even think it would have went to court.
Does your work extend to just the JFK death, or do you extend over to the Tippit scenario? Because Dallas police, there's a quote from one of the main police chiefs that talks about, we don't have enough evidence to incriminate Oswald on the assassination of JFK, but we have enough to get him on Tippit. And that's kind of where I think that would be where they would try and get him on, because you saw the witnesses. I mean, witnesses described someone that really didn't fit Oswald's description, but then they were able to pick him out of a lineup and say that's the guy. Now, I don't know what that is, but it had me thinking different about Texas police at that time, like forcing an interrogation. I mean, he was in a lineup, I think. There was a couple of times he was in a lineup, but one of the times he was in a lineup with like two police officers. Then he was in there with someone else that was also worked for the police thing. They were just wearing different jackets. And it's like they weren't giving him a fair chance in that aspect. And if we remember the Patsy video where he talks about I'm a patsy, he also said, nobody has told me why I'm being arrested. Nobody's. So is he saying he wasn't read his Miranda rights? So obviously he's going to be out anyway.
I'm not too sure if I'm not even too sure off the top of my head if Miranda rights were a thing when Oswald was arrested. I don't even think they were. I mean, I think I'll need to check that out actually and look when Miranda rights were introduced. But I know that, like, for example, I'm listening to a book on the Robert Kennedy case just now called A Lie Too Big to Fail from Lisa Pease. And apparently, when Sirhan was in custody, when he requested a lawyer, the police were then told, right, don't question him anymore until he's been given a lawyer. And that's basically how it should work. You know, Oswald publicly called for called for someone to come forward to give him assistance. He wanted legal representation, and nobody came forward, or so we know that nobody came forward. Someone might have, but they were just never given access to Oswald. I know that. I know somebody. I can't remember the guy's name. Did go in to see him in prison, very briefly, but he said he wasn't interested in representing Oswald. So they would have been better. They would have been better, obviously, if Oswald had lived and he had actual competent counsel representing him. Then all these files that are kept under national security have been for 60 years, whatever. All these files would have been open to Oswald's defence counsel, for obviously for the benefit of his defence. So that's quite interesting. And I know for a fact that Mark Lane tried to represent him before the Warren Commission, because the article I spoke about earlier, A Lawyer's Brief, somebody sent that to Marguerite Oswald, which was Oswald's mother, and Oswald's mother contacted Mark Lane and asked Mark Lane if she would represent Oswald before the Warren Commission. Mark Lane reached out, and he was basically told that they weren't interested in giving Oswald counsel. And then after some scrutiny, they reversed it, and they appointed a guy who's the head of the Bar Association. I'll just tell you what his name is just now, because that's really going to annoy me.
You got
If
a
I
lot
don't
of names off the top of your head.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I've been trying to. I've just studied this case for so long that it kind of just stick in there. But I'll tell you what the guy's name just is now. Is I'll tell you just now. This is really annoying.
Well, while you find that, there is a document in the 2021 release, which is what I've been studying for the past couple of weeks now. And one of them is quoted Garrison, possible defamation to CIA. And it is a document now looking at like what they're inserting as Garrison to be kind of an enemy of the agency in a sense. It's not just Garrison; it's also Brown, Johnson Brown. Both of them are they coming up with new evidence that could defame the agency? And I know from Watergate, William Colby, if you look up his name, is quoted in many articles saying that there's quotes saying CIA would never recover from this type of blow because of what he did whistleblowing the actions that the CIA was doing that ended up leading into the Watergate scandal.
I mean, yeah, that's what I mean. Nowadays, we know like different things that went on, like Watergate and all this kind of all these other kind of stuff. Back in the 1960s, people like when the assassination happened, 63. I think to question, obviously, the government, he would have been looked upon as like kind of crackpot. But that's why I always feel indebted to people like Mark Lane or Harold Weisberg or Sylvia Megar, you know, because these people and Josiah Thompson, etc. These people, when it wasn't popular to do it, and by the way, it was under well, Mark Lane put himself in the firing line a lot because obviously he was basically speaking out about the case, etc. It wasn't a popular thing to do. I think even Mark Lane said that when he was coming back, he was requested, he was in London, I think, or he was in Europe, and he was requested to come back to the States to give evidence before the Warren Commission. He was stopped at customs because he was put on the lookout list. So these are these kind of like personal sacrifices these people were making, and they felt like it was their duty because it was their president that was killed, and no one was investigating it. The Dallas police, once Oswald was killed, the investigation shut, and all the evidence got shipped off to Washington for the second time. So the case has never been investigated. And Harold Weisberg said that in an interview I was watching recently. He's got all these filing cabinets behind him, and the interviewer's asking him, is there nothing in these filing cabinets or nothing in the on these files that are getting withheld? And he kind of says he'd be surprised, but he did say no, there's nothing in these filing cabinets to tell you who killed the president because it was never investigated. It was never investigated. It started with Oswald, it ended with Oswald. They didn't care if he had conspirators. They didn't care if he was innocent or guilty, really. And I think the Dallas police, I think their track record under Henry Wade, for example, that's really been brought under the spotlight in the last, say, 15 years because the DA that took over from Wade, which is a guy called Craig Watkins, who basically was like slamming Wade's office and said there was like a kind of like racist cowboy mentality, etc. And basically they were just like rigging juries to pick who they wanted to be convicted, etc. And there was a lot of racist terminology as well used. A lot of minorities getting set up for crimes they didn't commit, but they're face fit. So yeah, we're pinning it on him, and no one really cared. It was all about conviction rate.
Well, that's why I wouldn't say I disagree with you. I just probably have a different take of Oswald being innocent in court. I just think we're looking at it from 2020 vision when we say court evidence that would go today. I mean, court evidence back then, the amount of manipulation that goes on. I mean, if we're in another timeline where freaking Oswald lived and he gets to court, how much evidence and how deep does it go about information that it's going to end up exposing? Maybe not after the fact, because a lot of our documents we do have after 1963, but also but knowing about stuff before. I mean, if it's true that he's tied in with Central Intelligence, then you really have a core issue there where that would be a private door scenario like a 9/11 was. You'd have a private door court appointment like that. So then maybe it wouldn't even be done fairly. Maybe they'd come to agreement, hey, we're not going to deport your wife, but you're going to have to go away for a while and you're never going to be able to speak about this again. We know that Marina was probably forced in interrogation to answer things or say things just to get out of there because they were threatening to take away her citizenship. I mean, that would still happen in the same scenario, but you would have Oswald living and going to jail for a very long time, or you would end up getting like Abraham Bolden's a good example. He went away on some trumped up charges. Then he ends up getting pardoned by Biden. So that was in our realist example. He didn't go to the extent that Oswald did, but for Oswald, it might be the same scenario. Somebody going away for a long time and then ending up getting pardoned later.
I think I think there was just too much spotlight on it to be any kind of deals. I mean, the Dallas police and the FBI and the media were telling the people that this is the man that killed your president, and people would wanted to have seen him on trial, and they wanted the facts to come out in a public trial. So I don't think there would have been, in my opinion, I don't think there would have been any kind of deal, because the public, the pressure would have been far too great for that to happen. We can there's no way to kind of substitute Oswald in this whole scenario thing. You know, people do mock trials. I think only one mock trial actually has found Oswald guilty, and that was the kind of scripted one done from London Weekend Television in the 80s with Vince Bugliosi and Jerry Spence. But I mean, Mark Lane also said the prerequisite of a trial is a live defendant, and obviously there can be no trial without Oswald. But there's no way to put a kind of price on what Oswald could have told us. You know, how did he get to the Texas Theater, for example? You know, in the whole Tippett thing, how did he get there? Did he get a lift? Did he get a bus? What route did he walk? Did anyone see him on that route? You know, so there is no way to kind of fill in for Oswald. You know, where was he during the assassination? Was he outside? Was he on the first floor? He certainly wasn't on the sixth floor. But where was he during the assassination? You know, so I genuinely think that's why he was murdered. He was murdered to stop him going to trial. And bearing in mind, J. Edgar Hoover on the 23rd said that something along the lines of, we have this man in Dallas, but the case isn't very strong. It's not very strong to get conviction. And the case hasn't moved since then. So that's what he said.
Have you talked to Bart Camp at all?
Oh, yeah, I know Bart quite well.
When he talks about prayer man, I think we got to think about that as well too. I mean, if you look at the number of people that would be brought up to the stand as witnesses, how many people would want to talk about that they knew Oswald? I mean, nobody wanted to even talk about or talk to anybody about Oswald that didn't fit with the official story. I mean, there are people that were interviewed. There was a guy with a DUI from like 10 years ago that he knew that if he said anything about Oswald or acted like he knew him or gave him any information on anything, they could have pulled that up out of nowhere. It doesn't seem like much to us. It's 10 years ago. But if you're that person happened to be African American, so you get to an aspect of Dallas politics at that time. I mean, how tied in with everything they are. We knew that they were tied in with gangs back then. And then we ended up finding out later that the CIA was tied in with mafia. So you just get into this aspect of like, all right, so how fragile is our court system to be actually given a fair trial? I mean, there's just a lot of conflicting things in there. I agree with the aspect, like, guilty until proven, and we have Oswald that died. So there is no trial for that. I believe that there should have been a trial. I think a lot of people do. But there's also like, if it was a trial that was going to happen, would it be done in the correct manner? I mean,
yeah, that's the thing. What I was saying earlier, it might have been impossible for Oswald to get a fair trial in the United States. I mean, that's a real possibility. Certainly would have been. There certainly is a real possibility that the trial would have been moved out of Dallas to maybe another part of Texas or maybe out of state, something like that. Walt Brown, I don't know if you know Walt's work. Walt Brown is a personal friend of mine. He's done a lot of work on the Kennedy assassination. He wrote, his first book was called The People versus Lee Harvey Oswald, and it was set in an alternative universe, obviously, alternative reality where Oswald survives the assassination attempt on him. He goes to court, and Walt Brown uses the Warren Commission's evidence against Oswald, and it's how a competent defense lawyer would have took that evidence and basically ripped it to shreds. And it's a really good book. It's called The People versus Lee Harvey Oswald, and it's very interesting. And I think in it, Walt Brown does say that they would have tried to convict Oswald on the Tippett case. But certainly, if they tried to go and try him for the Kennedy case, I don't see how he could have got convicted other than if the jurors were that biased, no matter what they heard, they were just going to vote for guilty anyway, which we know could have been a possibility because the juries were stacked. We know Wade done that. The Dallas DA's office did that. They stacked the juries against the individual. And as you were saying about, as I was saying actually earlier about the attorney that the commission appointed to Oswald. It was a guy called Walter E. Craig, and he was president of the American Bar Association. And the commission basically said that Craig was to participate in the investigation and to advise the commission whether, in his opinion, the proceedings conform to the basic principles of American justice. And it's quite funny that Sylvia Meagher actually says in her book that the Warren Commission should not have required a reminder from the head of the ABA to recall that an accused person has a fundamental right to self-defense and the benefit of reasonable doubt, even posthumously. And it's quite funny, the man who was appointed Oswald's defender, who actually only attended a handful of the commission hearings, actually stated that he was not representing the interests of Lee Harvey Oswald. We are representing the interests of the American people. And it's quite funny that Craig actually never objected to anything. He never submitted evidence into the proceedings. He never done anything. So basically, he was non-existent. And the thing that always gets me about Craig, he asked the question of William Greer, who, do you know who that was, a limo driver, right? So this is what Craig says. He says to Greer, he says, with respect to the position of the president's car that you were driving as it approached the underpass, you state now that you couldn't fix any specific distance when the shots rang out. But would you say it was less than a mile that the car was from the overpass? A mile, less than a mile. I mean, anyone seen a Zapruder film, they know that is a ridiculous statement to make. Or if they've even been to Dealey Plaza, they know it's a ridiculous statement to make. But that's just how inept Craig really was with the facts of the case. And that's why I believe that Mark Lane was denied his request to represent Oswald, because I'm pretty confident that Lane would have admitted evidence into the proceedings. He would have called his own witnesses. He would have cross-examined witnesses. Anything that a competent defense lawyer does. And obviously, as well, we know that if Oswald went to court, that his wife couldn't testify against him because of marital privilege law. And so that means that the backyard photographs couldn't be admitted into evidence, because the only witness to the backyard photographs is Marina Oswald, and she can't testify against Oswald. So that wouldn't have been allowed into a court of law. And just various other things as well, like the paper bag that I touched on earlier. There is no evidence. There is no crime scene photographs which depict the bag in situ. There is no scientific evidence that you could link the bag to the broken down Mannlicher. And also, I reached out to Beale Fraser on Facebook, Beale Wesley Fraser, Cut and Rod story and all that jazz. And I asked him a question on Facebook, and he actually responded. And I said to him, on the 21st of November, did you notice Oswald come into your car with a made-up bag or a pre-made bag or materials to make a bag or anything like that? And he said he did not. So where does he make the bag about? Where does he get the materials from? Well, the materials for the bag came from the depository. And what's quite funny about that is that the man who basically overseen the packing department in the Texas School Book Depository was a man called Troy West. And Troy West, he testifies before the commission, and he states pretty unequivocally that he never noticed Oswald around his packing station. He never witnessed Oswald make a bag. He never helped Oswald make a bag. He never seen Oswald around there. And what makes that testimony quite interesting is the fact that West was one of these guys that just never left his workstation, even lunched at his workstation. So, like, for Oswald to have made the bag, he would have done so under West's supervision or gaze or whatever, but West never sees it. So that's quite an interesting aspect of it as well. So you have the fact that there is no scientific evidence that links the bag to the rifle. You have no witness that can place Oswald making the bag, and there is no crime scene photographs of the bag in situ. Now, bearing in mind, in the commission exhibits, I can't remember off the top of my head what exhibit is. There is a picture of a window near the so-called sniper's nest, and it's a dotted line of where the bag should have been. A dotted line. I mean, this is the extent that the kind of Warren Commission and went to try and place a paper bag on the 6th floor. And again, the witness testimony about the bag is all over the place as well. Some officers testified that they never seen a bag. Some officers testified that they did see a bag. but there certainly is no hard evidence to back up that testimony.
Have you read a lot of what the National Archives says about the case?
I'm actually in talks with the National Archives at the minute to try and get some evidence photographed, which has taken a lot longer. It's been like a 3-year process to try and get something photographed. But I have read. I mean, I think officially maybe, but not off the top of my head. I just thought they always took the Warren Commission kind of line.
They in somewhat they do, but I think the aspect of where the Warren Commission would probably be the downfall if it was brought to trial is how thorough they are. They are thorough. They're very thorough. You cannot knock them on that. But what they're thorough in is not the necessary things you should be thorough in an investigation. Like they're talking to the second niece who's twice removed from the family who was in fucking Oklahoma at the time, and they're like, "Why the fuck? Why are you reaching out to someone that's has no connection to Dallas at all and is not even, there's no relation there." And what I started to notice was that if you look at the witnesses that say something different, I've never seen a police investigation start speculating on the person's character. And it's what they started doing with a lot of these witnesses. Someone that said, I never saw the person I saw shoot Tippit was a taller guy. And then there was a short, chunky guy that killed Tippit. And it's like, well, this person has been, and then they say something about the person's character after they give a little statement or something like that, where I go, anybody in court would flag that, bring that witness in and talk to that person. So you're not only having one person's life get slandered, which is Oswald, and then Oswald's family, but you now have witnesses that are coming out saying some things and then being rejected or turned down or being forced to comply to an official statement that they already are trying to basically project a narrative.
I'm gonna read you something, and I want you to tell me if you've ever heard of this before, right? So you know who Ted Calloway is, right?
I know Ted Calloway.
Right. So Ted Calloway was obviously a witness,
Yeah.
not a witness to the shooting of Tippit,
He
but he
was a
was a
witness
witness
to
to
the, yeah.
someone fleeing, right? So Ted Calloway, this is what he was told
Wait,
by Captain.
is Ted the guy from the truck?
Ted Calloway owned no, that's Domingo Benavides.
Okay.
That's Benavides was in the truck. Ted Calloway owned like a kind of car showroom or something like that, right? So Ted Calloway was told this by Captain Will Fritz before going into view Oswald, okay? He says, we want to be sure. We want to try and wrap him up real tight on killing this officer. We think he is the same one that shot the president. And if we can wrap him up tight on killing this officer, then we have got him. That's to a witness before they go and view a lineup. That's incredible.
That's why I said I've been thinking differently about Dallas police at the time, because the number of people that were coerced into making a certain choice or a certain statement. I mean, you have to keep that into account as well too. And I think there's prime evidence to show that they got rid of him just so there wasn't a trial. Jack Ruby, I don't know if you've ever looked into him, but he was $44,000 in debt to the IRS, and he's literally like after the assassination or after the him killing Oswald, he's speculating buying another club, and then all his debts are wiped. And people could say, well, he went to jail, so they wiped his debts. I'm like, you keep your fucking debts when you go to jail, but it's from the IRS. Like the IRS doesn't just stop. So I mean, and it's just weird. A lot of the statements from Jack Ruby did not make any sense. And I think if you can question Oswald, you can also question the same thing with Jack Ruby. I mean, there's ties in there with the Warren Commission. There's ties in there in the government, in my opinion. I know people could say that's speculation, but I'm like, look, he's a mafia guy saying cops never frequented his club, but then you have witnesses saying that there were definitely cops at the club. You just got a whole bunch of this back and forth, but you realize that there's something more powerful, and that is how Dallas police ran. That's how all these things ran. People were kind of scared in a situation.
Yeah, I think I think you're right. I think there was a lot of people that were scared, and especially when witnesses, whether they were dying of natural causes or it was suspicious, when witnesses were starting to die, a lot of witnesses started to get really scared. And I know, like, by reading stuff like The Girl on the Stairs by Barry Ernest, he was like in Dallas in the late 60s, and he was trying to track people down. And I can't remember off the top of my head, but he was trying to speak to people, and these people were very like not paranoid in the sense that they were paranoid for no reason. Like these people were like terrified that if they spoke about what they saw or whatever, then something bad would happen to them. Look at Aquila Clemens, for example. Say people or officers or whatever went to her door and says that if you talk, then you're going to get hurt. And then obviously she talked to Mark Lane, and then I don't know what happened to her after that. I think she left Dallas or something like that. But then, like the guy Warren Reynolds, he was shot in the head after he says that Oswald was not the man he was following, and then he woke up
Coincidence.
in hospital. Yeah, and then he said that Oswald was the guy. So, I mean, and there's myriad of problem with the Tippett case as well. I mean, Helen Markham, for example. I mean, she's the star witness, right? She was the one that says that Oswald was, well, she never said Oswald. She said the number two man. And if you ever read that, kind of back and forth during her testimony, that's really painful. And yeah, stuff like that, stuff like the shell casings have no chain of custody in the Tippett case. There's different markings. So, for example, say there was two Remington and two Winchester found. The shells were two Remington and two Winchester, but it was three Remington and one Winchester slug that was taken out of Tippett's body, something like that. And it was kind of along the lines of, well, the shells don't match the bullets taken from the victim. So then, obviously, people that advocate for Oswald's guilt say, oh, he must have had a missed shot then. Well, where's the evidence that there was a missed shot? You're saying that this guy just assassinated the president of the United States with some crack shooting, yet he's going to miss a police officer from over the hood of their car. It makes no sense. So that's just again speculation. But there is a lot of problems, and of course there is some witnesses that say it wasn't Oswald. I mean, Barry Ernest, when he went to Dallas in the late '60s, interviewed Mr. and Mrs. Donald Higgins, and they were reluctant to speak. And eventually, Mrs. Higgins says that the man who killed the officer was not the man who was on TV, meaning Oswald. So there is people that say that wasn't Oswald that killed the police officer. And in fact, Benavides, in his original testimony, said that, or original statements, because he said he couldn't identify Oswald, so he wasn't taken to a lineup. But Benavides said that when the shooting happened, he crouched down in the kind of floor of his van for like a couple of minutes and waited, and then he got out to try and request assistance for the officer. And then obviously he was trying to work the police radio. Then TF Bowley came along and helped him. But when Bowley came on the scene and Tippett was already dead, he checked his watch and it was like 1:10. But if you're really interested in the Tippett case, then really check out the research of Larry Harris. Larry Harris is like the foremost authority on the Tippett case. Larry Harris is dead now. I think he died. He died in a car accident, but he was like the authority on the Tippett case. I think he co-authored the book with J. Gary Shaw as well. But he spoke at a lot of conferences about it. And obviously Joe McBride's done a lot of work on the Tippett case as well. But I think what you've got to do is you've got to look at both sides as well. You've got to look, okay, so this is why Oswald's innocent. Why do you think Oswald's guilty? What's the evidence for that? In my opinion, you've got to equate yourself with both sides to really properly either defend Oswald or really kind of know the case, you know?
Do you factor in media's power and all this as well too? I mean, today, if we look at, let's take an examination of if somebody, I would say, is wrongfully convicted or the public sparks up enough cry. Let's take the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard trial. Now, when the trial was going, everybody I think was on Johnny's side. I don't think it swayed opinion. Obviously, we found out who was honestly right in that case scenario. But even before that stuff started, everyone was pro Johnny. They were waiting outside of the building for them. And I look at the aspect, imagine if you just labeled this person as a communist and you just labeled this person as killing the president. I mean, how many people are just going to want to see you be guilty, be sent to jail, not even listen to facts? They're already going to have a biased view. So that's a big thing in court to try and get them away from that and bring them to what the evidence is, even showing them a bunch of things. Maybe it could wake them up. But I think as much as the power of the media is to slander somebody, there's a lot of power in the way that it can also help somebody. We know with the Innocence Project, getting wrongfully convicted people out, a lot of that is done through talking about it on media and getting people to support you. And then you investigate into something and you get the support towards a person that you think is innocent, and they end up resolving it in trial or in court. And I think if you look at the recordings at the day of the assassination and when it happened, they kept updating live updates and stuff like that. I mean, they didn't know he died until like an hour or two in. Like they were talking about Kennedy is critically wounded and he's brought to Parkland Hospital. It's like we know he died when in the vehicle. He didn't survive that, but they were just wrongfully speculating in a sense, much like I kind of do at times too. But they were wrongfully speculating to a point where I think for people listening to that little bit, if you would have turned off the TV, you would have already had a justified view in your head. I think Jim Mars is the best example. He fell asleep. Um, when Kennedy was killed, and he woke up and someone woke him up. Hey, the president was just shot. And he was like, because he was in his viewpoint, he was more conservative, he said. And so you already have like people that are kind of waking up to it, like literally legit waking up to the news of Kennedy. And then you have people watching it as it's updating. And if you're not watching it fully, you turn off the TV, go do something. I mean, it's a 6-hour broadcast. I had to pee at some moment. So it's like, you're going to miss a certain section that might be important, and it might give you the wrong information where you might just have a bunch of riled up people ready to convict Oswald no matter what the evidence says.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was going back to with the fair trial. I think it might have been I think it'd be neon impossible to try and give him a fair trial in Dallas. I think it probably would have been moved. Whether he could have got a fair trial in the United States, I'm not even sure of. Um, I think I think that he, I think Oswald, I think once the evidence was presented, it would sway some people, but it might not sway all. But then you've got the state would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt of his guilt. And I mean, there's so many things that Wade was saying, and like Curry was saying, and Fritz were saying. I mean, these guys were going on TV and basically saying, "Yeah, this man's done it. This man's guilty," and you can't be saying that. And it did actually warrant a lot of commenting by some other attorneys as well, that were kind of interested in the case. A guy called Percy Foreman, he commented on it. I think he actually eventually became a trial for a lawyer for Jack Ruby. And I know there was a guy called Joe Tonahill. Joe Tonahill became counsel for Jack Ruby. And it's quite funny because Tonahill was asked, and this was in the clip is on YouTube. And basically, an interviewer asks Joe Tonahill, he says, "Mr. Tonahill, what, in your opinion, would have been the outcome of a trial had Oswald gone to trial?" And Tonahill states, "In my opinion, under Texas law, a trial judge trying him, the judge would have had a weak circumstantial evidence charge to go to the jury. In my opinion, he wouldn't have had that. He would have been forced to instruct the jury to return a verdict of not guilty on the grounds of insufficient evidence." And this is a lawyer getting interviewed in the 60s. Obviously, Oswald's dead at this point, but this is a lawyer coming out saying the evidence is insufficient. And again, this is a quote from the American Civil Liberties Union, and this was included in Mark Lane's a brief for the defense. And it says, "In our opinion, Lee Harvey Oswald, had he lived, would have been deprived of all opportunity to receive a fair trial by the conduct of the police and the prosecution officials in Dallas under pressure from the public and the news media. From the moment of his arrest until his murder 2 days later, Oswald was tried and convicted many times in newspapers, on the radio, and other television by statements of Dallas law enforcement officials. Time and again, high-ranking police and prosecution officials state their complete satisfaction that Oswald was the assassin. As their investigation uncovered one piece of evidence after another, the results were broadcast to the public. Oswald's trial would have been nothing but a hollow formality." So that's them saying that, like, he would not have received it would have been extremely impossible for him to receive a fair trial because of their conduct. But I mean, the one thing that might have swayed a jury back then is when, like, of course, during a trial of Oswald, stuff like the autopsy findings would have been obviously made public knowledge. Testimony of the Dallas police, the Parkland doctors, nurses from Parkland, people that worked on the president's body, autopsy corpsmen, these people that obviously were sworn to secrecy, like Paul O'Connor and Jim Jenkins and stuff like that. And that's all covered in William Law's fantastic book, In the Eye of History. I really recommend that. It's a really good book. He just interviews like people that were actually at the autopsy working on the president's body, and they basically describe his wounds, how there was a mass exit wound at the back of the occipital parietal, and talking about like that's the back of the head. And then talking about like how obviously like the Parkland doctors were saying there was cerebellum falling onto the gurney and all this kind of jazz. But yeah, I mean, all this would have been brought out, and this is where it should have been brought out, you know. Instead, Oswald's death has kind of led to case closed and all these kind of theories coming out. And you know, a lot of the theories, a lot of them have been really have really hampered real important, real serious research, because people just dismiss the Kennedy assassination as a swamp and they don't want to get involved in it. There's too much disinformation. They're not interested. Or if you become interested, you become attacked. Like, and if you're high profile, like Oliver Stone, and I know Joe Rogan's talked about it as well, and he's been getting attacked as well for having Stone on his podcast. So, but what I'm trying to say is, if you really want to try and understand the assassination and what happened to President Kennedy, you've really got to kind of study the evidence against Oswald, and then you go, okay, this evidence is really bad, it's really shoddy, it with no way to any kind of like intelligent human being say, right, okay, this would result in conviction. Then it would then stand that President Kennedy was assassinated as a result of conspiracy. Because I don't think we will ever know who killed him, in my opinion. But that doesn't stop us trying to figure out what happened to him. And there's something really important as well that I always say to people, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with the testimony of Lee Bowers. Do you know so Lee Bowers is a very important witness. He was interviewed for Mark Lane's Rusted Judgment. He was also interviewed before he testified before the Warren Commission. And I can't recite his testimony like off by heart, but Bowers basically says at the time of the assassination there was cars coming into the parking lot, which obviously was behind the picket fence or the grassy knoll. Okay, so cars were coming in, circling, and then leaving, and then one came in, and then he says that he noticed two figures standing behind the fence during the assassination. And he says that I think he says one of them was dressed in uniform. I can't remember. Anyway, he says that something happened out of the ordinary that caught his eye during the assassination, like a flash of light or something like that, right? Bowers was killed in like 1966. I think he crashed into a bridge or something like that. But what I always say to people is this, okay? Bowers' testimony places two people behind that picket fence during the assassination of the president, okay? If these two people were innocent bystanders, okay, then why have they never came forward to this day and said, well, I was behind that fence and I never seen anybody? Or why did they disappear after the assassination? If they were just innocent bystanders, why would they do that? Why would they not come forward and say, well, I was behind that fence and I seen nobody? You know, the shooting couldn't have came from here. But they never came forward. And we know two people were standing there because Bowers places them there. So it's always kind of like interesting. And then you have the fact that the police officer runs up the knoll after the shooting, and a man brandishes Secret Service credentials. Joe Marshall Smith was the police officer's name. And then the guy produces Secret Service credentials and says he's with the Secret Service, and Smith lets him go. Why is that interesting? Because there was no Secret Service agents left in Dealey Plaza. They all went to the Parkland with the president. So stuff like that is really interesting. And then Smith says, I think during his testimony, says the guy just didn't look like a Secret Service agent. He looked like a mechanic or something like that. You know, that's me just saying off the top of my head. But there was somebody brandishing these kind of credentials after the assassination to people, you know. And also you've got like the other witnesses as well, like the railroad men on the bridge that says that they ran to the behind the picket fence after, etc.
And the guy on the overpass that walked through on a news broadcast, he walked through the parking lot and showed the guy goes, "How many cars do you think were in this parking lot?" He goes, "It was bumper to bumper." But he talked about seeing smoke come off from the grassy knoll, I think it was.
Yeah, it was SM Holland. SM Holland. Do you know it's funny because in Barry Arnett's book, right? Barry goes to meet SM Holland when he's in Dallas, and he brings 2 bodyguards with him.
I would be scared too.
So so stuff that's quite interesting. But yeah, as I said, like it is a fascinating subject, and I think you can go down rabbit holes pretty easily. Like for example, there's probably people that still believe Castro killed President Kennedy or Khrushchev killed him, you know, or this organization killed him or that. I think you just got to stick to, in my opinion, you just got to stick to the evidence, and
Well,
that's the clearest picture that we can have of what happened. You know,
Russia has a whole goddamn file on the assassination of JFK. Anybody that kills the president is not going to make a file on it. They were making sure that they could cover their own ass.
I think basically what happened was when the president was killed, um, one of the, I think it was the agency, they wanted to use that as a preempt. They wanted to basically use Oswald as this communist sympathizer that was working for Castro as basically basically the green light to invade Cuba. And Johnson wouldn't allow it. Johnson said that he says that he doesn't, and that's what he says to like Errol Warren and Richard Russell. He says he doesn't want this blamed on Castro or blamed on Khrushchev and getting drawn into a war that could kill millions of Americans in a nuclear strike. So and obviously, and that was his worry apparently. So, but yeah, that's what I mean. So there was people chomping at the bit to use that to go into Cuba. And that was the whole thing. If you read the Lopez report, which like details Oswald in Mexico City and all that kind of stuff, you know what was going on down there in 1963, how they're trying to say Oswald was there, he was trying to get to Cuba and all that kind of jazz. But Castro actually has a good speech on this. He says, or he made a statement about it, and he said, "How do you think it would look if this guy managed to get into Cuba, and then he comes back from Cuba and assassinate and is blamed, and is basically said that this man is the man that killed the president? It would look really suspicious how he just came from Cuba and in the United States." So, but Oswald is an enigma. There is no question about it. You know, he goes to Russia, he has a Russian wife, comes back with a Russian wife and child, doesn't get officially debriefed. There's nobody arresting him for treason. He just is allowed to wander back into the United States. He's loaned the money from the State Department to come back. I mean, it's plainly obvious to me that he's some sort of false fake defector, but I mean, trying to prove it might be another thing. But again, there's guys done really good work on this, like John Newman, Oswald and the CIA. I mean, it's a fantastic book. But yeah, there's a lot of research out there, a lot of good research out there, and there's a lot of bad research out there as well. It's just about trying to separate the two, and some people it takes years, but that's why we do what we do. You know, that's why I'm here talking, because I want to basically educate people on this, and I want people to really kind of study the case against Oswald. Okay, so people say, "Oh, he's guilty," and that's it. But it's like, okay, so why is he guilty? What's the evidence against him? You know, and that's what I try and get people to really think about, and that's what my whole contribution to Case Not Closed was, and the articles that I read as well. It was about, okay, let's put each piece of the evidence under a spotlight and let's see how credible it is. Like the shells, for example, that were found on the 6th floor. According to Tom Allier, who was a cameraman for WFAA TV, who actually got into the depository and filmed the police as they were searching the floors, etc. He says that Fritz went behind the shielded boxes, picked up the shells on the floor. Allier filmed them in his hand. Fritz put the shells in his pocket. Then he went over, gave the shells to, I think, Studebaker, who was the photographer, Studebaker didn't know what the original placement of the shells was, so he just threw the shells down on the floor and took the photographs. And this is according to Tom Allier. And Allier believes Oswald's guilty. So Allier isn't going to lie.
We have Polaroid photos to prove it. Polaroids places those bullets there.
So it's all kind of interesting things. I mean, like C543, which was the bullet with the dented lip. There's been many people that have studied that bullet and that origin and says it could have been used during the assassination. There's no chain of custody on the shells either, which were found on the 6th floor. I mean, these shells were put into an unmarked, unsealed envelope. The shells were not marked at the scene by the officers that came into contact with these shells, which should have been standard police procedure. You mark the shells there and then, or you mark, nowadays it's a tag. But you have, as soon as you come into contact that piece of evidence, or you handle that piece of evidence, you mark it, and then it goes to the next person, they mark it, so it's all documented. And I think the guy, I can't remember the guy's name, he basically never got the shells back till about 10 o'clock at night in this unsealed, unmarked envelope, and then he proceeded to mark the hull, the shell. But imagine all this coming out in a court of law. I mean, it would really make the Dallas police really, really foolish.
I think you probably would have a better case now for just at least clearing his name, at least for the families as well too. I know it's got to be a hard thing to be, related to Oswald and have that your dad or whoever killed the president. It's difficult thing probably to live with, especially if a lot of them kept their last name. So you're not changing it over. At least Marina switched it. She has it as her middle name now, and it's Porter as her last name because she remarried. But it's a tough situation, not only for just the families, but other people that were involved in it as well too. People that feel like they probably need to speak up. But you have Howard Hunt at least with a dying letter to his son or a video to his son talking about all these crazy things he fucking did.
Yeah, he was basically blaming Johnson, I think, ultimately, and he was saying stuff like there was other guys involved. He was calling it a big event and stuff like that. Again, I don't really know how credible it is. I'm not sure. It could be credible, it might not. There's been so many people have came out, like James Files, for example, says that he's the one that shot Kennedy and all this kind of stuff. I don't believe it.
It's the what is it? The Zodiac killer. When they were looking for the Zodiac killer, a bunch of people came forward talking about they would just ask him questions like, how did you kill your victims? With a hammer. It's like Zodiac killer never used a hammer. But people just wanted the fame aspect because of how big it got. I mean, at this point now, if you say you have information on Kennedy's killer, you have a bunch of people lining up at your door trying to figure out what that is. But it's been so littered with, a bunch of different conspiracies and things of that sort. There's valid ones and then there's unvalid ones. And it's kind of hard to decipher what those things are. But I mean, I can appreciate the amount of information you got on things as well too. I think that's definitely something that would be held up in a court if it was brought in there today. But it's about getting people interested in it now to be able to, have a certain second case go on.
I think a lot of people now would say, it's been 60 years. A lot of people probably aren't interested. A lot of people should be interested because if they can do it to John Kennedy in 1963, then they could do it today. And I don't know who they are, by the way. I'm just paraphrasing, whoever was behind the plot. But we obviously know today as well, something that we didn't know in the 1960s and the 1970s, that there was an attempt, there was going to be two plots, the other two plots in Chicago and in Tampa as well. So, and there was another patsy, a guy called Thomas Arthur Valley. He was going to be the other patsy. I think the Chicago plot was the one that Abraham Bolden was trying to tell the Warren Commission on. So we know there was other plans to try and assassinate him. But if you think about this, okay, if you think about this, if it was attempted, it had to succeed. Okay, can you imagine, for example, if it was attempted and it failed and John Kennedy survived? Can you imagine Bobby Kennedy's Justice Department all over? They would have been all over this. They would have found out who was involved. They would have found everything out. When the president was killed, Bobby lost all his power. He never had the same power as before, and I think that's touched upon by David Talbot in Destiny Betrayed, when Bobby had a phone on Hoover's desk, and it was the direct link to Hoover. And after the assassination, the phone was taken away, and Hoover wouldn't return any of his calls. So, and then obviously Bobby resigned in 1964 and ran for a senator in New York. But yeah, it's quite interesting when people obviously say, yeah, but Bobby obviously never pursued his brother's killer, and he endorsed the Warren Commission, etc. But we obviously know today that Bobby didn't believe the Warren Commission. In fact, Robert Kennedy Jr. It came out in the last few years and says that his dad thought the Warren report was a shoddy piece of craftsmanship, and I'm convinced that had Robert Kennedy became president of the United States, not only would have been one hell of a president, but he would have reopened the case, and he would have reopened the murder case, and he would have found out who killed his brother. I think that was one of his motivations to run for the presidency, because I think by reading about Bobby and Bobby felt that Bobby really loved his brother, and he really it haunted him. His assassination really haunted him, and he felt like he needed to carry on his brother's work. And I think 1972 was when they thought obviously it would have been the first opportunity, but then obviously Johnson, McCarthy comes into the race in '68. Kennedy then comes into the race. Johnson then says he doesn't want to seek the nomination for another term, and then I'm convinced I'm convinced pretty much that Robert Kennedy probably would have won the presidency, because his support was so great, and he would have ran against Nixon, and I think he would have beat Nixon. But I'm convinced, in my opinion, I think Robert Kennedy was killed because of his intention to reopen the John Kennedy
Well, that's
case.
what he said to the Secret Service members. He talked about that he wanted to find out who killed his brother, and he didn't think that there was ever going to be an answer to that. A lot of people point to that as a reason why they might have taken him out. I just don't buy the Kennedy curse. I get that there's a lot of things people say coincidence, but Jesus Christ, coincidence to a point, man. You got fucking three Kennedys that died. It's a little bit suspicious there. Something to question for sure. But Johnny, you given me enough of your time, man. Is there a place where people can find any of your links, man?
Yeah, sure. So if you go into Kennedys and King, and you type in my name on Kennedys and King, it'll come up my articles. Or go into Google and type a presumption of innocence, Lee Harvey Oswald. Part 1, 2, and 3 are on Kennedys and King. I've done talks on YouTube. So I've done talks for the Dealey Plaza UK that's been uploaded onto YouTube. I think Vince Palomara has uploaded a couple of them. And the book Case Not Closed as well. If you like what you read, or you're interested, or it whets your appetite, you can read what I kind of I've went into in the book, and it kind of greater detail as well. But I would also kind of recommend stuff like, if anyone's interested, reading stuff like Sylvia Meagher's Accessories After the Fact, or Jim DiEugenio's Reclaiming Parkland. I think it's called JFK, the Evidence Today. There's some really fantastic books on this case. There really is. And I would always say to anybody, whatever you read, don't take the information at face value. Also, do your own research, check out sources. A lot of authors will, they might put their own spin on things or whatever. Do your own research if you're really interested in it, and also take the opposing side's arguments as well, because you can't just have kind of one mindset that it's a conspiracy, or Oswald's innocent, blah blah, and not know the evidence against him as well. You've got to know all sides of it. So yeah, I'd always say, and approach it with an open mind. Don't just approach it with think it's a conspiracy, or don't just approach and say Oswald's guilty and that's it. I think a lot of people are very close-minded when they look at this case, but yeah, it's a worthwhile endeavor, and we owe it to people like President Kennedy to really keep searching for this truth.
Well, I'm going to link your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.